I am Debbie Veney. I'm with the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, and I am excited to be with you today. Thank you for joining us. We've got a great group of panelists, and we are going to talk with you about a campaign that we did this fall, which was about elevating Black voices for charter school choice. And specifically, we want to take you through the creative strategy behind that. We're going to share with you some of the creative materials that were developed. And this great group of panelists that we have here today are representing various organizations. They were partners of mine in executing this project. So I am going to kick off by inviting our first panelist, Ebony Lee, to introduce herself and tell you about the work that she does.
Thanks, Debbie, and I'm excited to be here with you all. I'm Ebony Lee, and I'm a partner at the Charter School Growth Fund, where I oversee our work around policy, communications, advocacy, and partnership. And I would say that this work around elevating Black voices in the charter school movement falls squarely into my wheelhouse, and in particularly the partnership aspect. So it was my great pleasure to work not only with the National Alliance, but also the individual CEOs that run charter schools across the country, and in particular the 14 market areas that were targeted during this campaign.
Great, thank you. It's great to have you here today.
Thanks.
And next up is George Parker.
Is my mic on? Is my mic on?
Your
Okay,
mic.
hello everybody. I'm George Parker. A little bit of my background. I was a classroom teacher, mathematics in DC public schools for 30 years. I was also president of the DC Teachers Union for 6 years. I think that the whole concept of elevating Black voices for the charter choice movement is so important because our kids of color and Black kids need opportunities and choice beyond what traditional public schools can offer. And so I think it is so important that we make the Black community aware of charter schools and what advantages they have and what they can present to parents as an option for their children. So I really believe we got to elevate Black voices in terms of the charter movement. And I appreciate you, Debbie, and those who have helped to articulate that the charter movement has to do a better job of speaking to the Black community because it has a lot to offer.
Thank you so much, George. And Kaleem, you're up next.
All right, Kaleem Caire, founder and CEO of One City Schools in Madison, Wisconsin, where we have 2 schools right now, a preschool and then an elementary school, but we're in the process of planning our middle high school now. And we're chartered by the University of Wisconsin system, which has given us access to kids across the state. So any child living in Wisconsin could go to our school. Most of them are within our region, but, you know, I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to be a part of this because, you know, as George just said, it's important for our young people to know who we're working on behalf of, that we have been at the forefront of this movement since the very beginning of charter schools in this country. Mostly our children of color who are going to these schools. We have to continue to elevate our voices and advocate for them. And then also, you know, we're not just running charter schools, we're running innovation. We're changing the way public education happens in America. And we think, given the fact that so many of our children are in public education, that we should be at the forefront of that. So I'm happy to be here. Debbie, thank you for inviting me. And George, it's good to be back on stage with you.
Hey, it's great to be here with you too.
We have a story back in DC. Nice to be with you too, Ebony.
Thank you so much, Kaleem. So I'm going to kick off here and just talk a little bit about the campaign itself. So this was called I Am, and it's really, that's a shorthand for I Am Black. So I'll talk to you a little bit about how this worked and how we cooked this up. So you guys may remember over the summer, the Democratic platform language was released, and specifically there was some language in there that was very, very harmful to charter schools. And this had to do with a couple of specific areas. So one of them is that charter schools were not even mentioned amongst the public school options that the platform named as important for educating children. Two, there was a proposal that was made that districts would in fact be the decision makers on whether a charter school would be able to get federal funding from the charter schools program, or in fact be able to even open, that there might be a fiscal test that the district would have to weigh in on. And then the third problematic area is that there was a proposal for a more stringent set of oversight, which would in fact have invalidated the role of authorizers in many places. So these were all very troublesome. And with that in mind, we were also noticing that the campaign, that while they had really been pretty reluctant to fully embrace charter schools, a lot of the charter school folks were also Biden campaign supporters. So there's a little bit of a disconnect here. And specifically, we can get a little bit more deep in that. The Black community delivered the Democratic nomination to Mr. Biden and the presidency. We saw what those poll numbers look like. And so the very people who delivered the nomination and the presidency to Mr. Biden really like charter schools, and they have a right to be heard on this issue. And the other thing that was also kind of troubling is that we were hearing from folks who were working either on the campaign or close to it, that they were a little, they were familiar with the perspective of what the National Alliance might say. I mean, charter schools is in our name. We're going to be advocating on behalf of charter schools. But they were not hearing from people on the ground in other communities and other places to say that, in fact, was truly an issue that matters to parents and communities. So with those things in mind, we said, well, if you need to hear from us, we're going to see if we can't make that so. And so we created this campaign. was created to really raise the campaign's awareness of Black voters who support charter schools. Also, it was intended to just generally increase public awareness of the diversity of charter school supporters, including those who are Democrats. So it's no secret to most people who are here in this meeting with us that charter schools are often thought of as being solely supported by Republicans, that they're thought of as schools that are run by white people and not by folks of color. They're thought of as, oddly enough, schools that exclude students of color and are places that are for privileged folks. And we wanted to kind of dispel some of the bad thinking around those particular issues. And then also to show that the teachers union education agenda does not equal the Democratic Party education agenda. So we wanted to get some other Democrats to kind of weigh in on the things that mattered to them. And then finally, really to humanize charter school supporters. So it was important to be able to show real faces, real people in real communities, and to not have them look like billionaires or people who were like doing fly-ins and didn't really understand that community and did not love these children and were not investing their own time and resources into creating better opportunities for our kids. So with all of that in mind, we launched this multimedia campaign. And so the campaign leveraged diverse voices, and it was intended to appeal directly to the Biden campaign with some direct, highly visible, and somewhat provocative messages. But we didn't go negative. It was provocative, but not negative. And so I Am Black is based on 3 statements. I'm Black, I'm a charter school supporter, and I vote. And there were a couple features with this. So part of it was a social media campaign, and we actually directly tagged the Biden campaign. Now, the Alliance did our part of it through our C4, the Charter School Action Fund, but we also worked directly with partners across the country And it was pretty powerful during our social media days of action to see the amount of energy and enthusiasm we had around this. We also had a radio media tour, and we had earned media where we elevated Black school leaders like Kaleem. And one of the things that was really important to us there was to make this as easy as possible for our school leaders. So we delivered these media opportunities directly to our leaders in various communities and just kind of set them up to be able to tell their stories to their audiences in their communities. And then the last piece of this was an advertising campaign that ran in 14 markets with spots that ran during morning news shows such as Good Morning America or CBS This Morning, and spot shows with on Black cable networks and women's networks, and then also Black radio, which was a really important piece of this. So in addition to the I Am Black campaign, we also had I Am, because we've got allies and we've got friends who may not be Black, but also care a lot about this issue. And so I Am was a way for Latinos, suburban moms, Democrats, even Republicans, young voters, really anybody who's a charter school supporter and wanted to elevate their voice to have a way to do that. And the idea here was, again, it was showing the diversity of our sector. So let me give you a peek at the markets that we looked at. So these 14 markets, I hope you can make out my little stars that we've got in the places, but these map to battleground states. And in a couple of places that are not battleground states, you might say to yourself, well, California is not a battleground state. You're right, it's not, but it's a major media market. And New York was also not a battleground state, but it's a major media market. And so we couldn't really do this work effectively and well without looking at an overlay of Nielsen rated markets, battleground states, and then a couple places, well, you just had to do it if you're going to do this work right. So we worked in these 14 markets and identified captains. So we had folks who were recruited, and Ebony helped me so much with that, helping me find folks who would be captains in these various markets. And we talked to them about what it meant to participate. And so this was a lot of groundwork. So sharing and cascading information out to schools and to other advocates, to parents in their communities, and getting people excited about being able to elevate and lift their voices up on this project. So our first social media day of action was scheduled on the second day of the Democratic National Convention. And so what we did was we created these filters. And it's my first time actually using a filter other than maybe like the bunny ears or the cats, if you've seen those on Facebook or Instagram. But it works the similar kind of way. So you use this filter and you take a selfie, and the selfie allowed us to really get at this point of driving home humanization, realness. So we wanted people to look any way they wanted to. So we've got one person here who's looking like, I'm frustrated. I'm a Democrat. I support charter schools and I vote. And that's, awesome. We also wanted, as I said, any number of people. This I Am Black was a part of it, but it could also have been any of the other groups that we talked about as well. So on the first day of it, we got about 700 unique engagements in one day across Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. The impressions were significantly higher than that, but for people who are in the media relations world, impressions are harder to understand sometimes. So I'm just going to go with the unique engagements, because that's somebody that swiped, clicked, liked, posted, retweeted. That's what specifically that means. And I'll tell you, as a person who does communications for a living, if I get like 7 of these in one day, the world is on fire and I am quite distressed. So I'm certain that with 700 of them coming directly at the Biden campaign in one day, they heard us. So let's take a look at how that looked. So this is a collage of some of the different folks who did take part in the day of action and the way that they chose to show up. So after our first day of action, we moved to phase 2, turning up the heat a little bit. So we had a radio media tour, which happened on October 6th and 7th. And by radio media tour, I mean we booked radio interviews across the country in all these states. And so Kaleem was actually one of our spokespersons. And we booked radio interviews for him, as well as we also shopped around and did different other types of media placements with traditional media such as newspapers in those markets. And on September 22nd, we began to do direct outreach to like 7,000 new charter school advocates. So one of the things that I noticed was we have a large footprint at the National Alliance. We have well over 20-some thousand folks who are on our lists. And we know that they get our information and they read it, but they weren't necessarily like motivated to take action in quite the same way. So we tried something a little bit different, and we did direct outreach to a whole new group of people. We were targeting parents, charter school teachers in battleground states. And so that's who those 7,000 people are. Then we also scheduled the second social media day of action on October 6th, which coincided with the radio media tour and also fell between the presidential and vice presidential debates. We also did television, radio, and digital ads that ran in these 14 key markets. And this campaign was white labeled. And by white labeled, I mean it did not carry the Alliance's name on it. We partnered with school leaders and with our charter state organizations and tagged them on it so that it looked like a local piece. It was important, if you're going to run a local radio spot, that you don't have a national entity that nobody's ever heard of as the tagline behind it. So that was really important. And we also thought it was a tremendous gift to be able to give to our partners on the ground, to be able to have their names and their logos appear in these spots. And it was done at no cost to them. So our advertising plan, we had a mix of morning news shows, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. This was Good Morning America, CBS This Morning, CBS This Weekend. And because we were doing spot buys and really put this together quickly on a shoestring budget, we just had one morning news spot that ran in each market. But we went very, very heavy on Black radio. We did a partnership with Radio One to purchase these local spots during nationally syndicated, highly ranked shows. So we did this really interesting, like, cafeteria style customization. We looked at what's the highest ranked nationally syndicated radio show that runs in each one of these battleground state markets and their biggest media markets, and that's where we bought our airtime. We also did targeted spot buys we were looking for women's programming and programming that hits women of color. So we had networks like VH1, Lifetime, TV1, BET, and OWN. And we had more than 100 paid spots in each one of those markets, plus at least 2 spots that aired daily in the 14 markets for 14 continuous days. And now, after having given an overview of the campaign, I'm going to bring our panelists back up, and I want to talk a little bit about the work that we did together. And also, thank you guys again for being such tremendous partners. So, Ebony, I'm going to start with you. This was a comprehensive campaign, lots of moving parts, lots of people involved. And I really appreciated having you as an advisor. Now, as someone who invests in charter schools, you have a really important perspective. You hear from a lot of CEOs, a lot of leaders, and I'm wondering, can you talk about the extent to which the campaign objectives resonated with the charter leaders that you work with?
Yeah, thank you, Debbie. I appreciate the question. Charter School Growth Fund supports a high number of leaders of color as a part of our portfolio. And the feedback that we have been hearing consistently, and in particular this year, because of the pandemic, and then also in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, a lot of increased interest and frustration, if I'm honest, about having their voices heard And so when this opportunity for this campaign came around, we saw a lot of interest and enthusiasm because people were willing to tell their story and to be seen, in a lot of cases for the first time. And what I would say is that this gave them an outlet and an opportunity to be seen and to be recognized for the work that they do, often very quietly in their neighborhoods. And so we've heard a lot of kind of talk about being community-led and community-driven. And what some people don't realize is that our Black and Brown leaders that aren't heads of large CMOs are in and of the community. They have chosen to stay or invest in these areas because they are products of these cities and they care deeply, but they are not necessarily the people that you see on the news every day or out front. And so this gave them that opportunity to say, I need to be seen and I need to be heard.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Now, Kaleem, among other goals, this campaign was really intended to dispel some common myths about charter schools, specifically that they're white-led, specifically that the leaders, as Ebony said, are people who are of that community, that they're not folks who kind of swoop in and don't understand it. As a charter leader of color, I'd like to get your sense of how important it is to address those kinds of misconceptions when doing this work.
Yeah, so, it's important for people to understand that we are a part of the past, present, and the future of public charter schools in America. Dr. Howard Fuller is one of my mentors. He's the one who actually got me engaged in the charter school movement back in the 1990s. He was the first African American that I'm aware of who actually was leading a major public school district in Milwaukee as superintendent in 1991 and 95. And he had proposed during his tenure to charter, most of, if not all, of the Milwaukee public school system. And when he did that, charter schools, there was a law passed in Milwaukee, there were laws being passed, but it elevated the conversation nationally. So he's continued to be at the forefront of the movement for charter schools. And it's important for us to understand that history. We've also had hundreds of African Americans start charter schools across the country. Some have succeeded, some have not, but that's the design of charter schools. You try it. If it doesn't work, you don't have to continue. But also there's the issue of what our children are doing. When you have 30, 40-year legacy in this country of young people where every year, whether you read the federal score, the scores that we look at that the U.S. Department of Education puts out with the NAEP scores, and you're looking at MAP scores and things that we're doing in schools now for testing children, where less than 20% of Black and Brown students still are testing below grade level in schools across this country. It's a crime if we don't try something different. And charter schools have been manifest in these communities to try to do that. And so it's important for our community to understand that these aren't people who just flown in to try to start schools. I'm sure there might be some of those people, but we're in a crisis mode and we're trying to do things differently, which charters give us the flexibility to do, to address the fact that less than 20% of Black and Brown kids read at grade level in this country. And then lastly, I'm looking at how do we redefine the charter school movement. Everything has to be disrupted. Everything has to move forward. Everything has to be innovated. And this is not a time for us as a Black community to say, oh, we should move away from charters. It's how do we do this better? How can these schools truly be the seeds of innovation and help us redefine what public education looks like in our country and how it's delivered to our community members across this country, our children, better in the future, because it's critical. The world moves faster now and charter schools are able to adapt faster. I think, it's important for people to understand the opportunity we have to create change through it.
Thank you for that, Kaleem. Excellent points. George, so you and I worked together at the Alliance, but you also have a very interesting background before we ever met each other at the Alliance, among other things. You have an interesting background actually in ethnic media, specifically Black radio. And you were a great partner for me when we were going about figuring out where we were going to run these ads. And wanted to ask you why you really were so excited and advocated about Black radio as a vehicle. Why do you think Black radio was a particularly effective vehicle for airing our spots?
Well, I think the first thing would be that that's where the people are. We listen to Black radio and television.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it is so important that the charter school system, the charter school body takes control of its own messaging to the Black community. I think charter schools offer an excellent option for us to educate our kids. But then if parents are not aware of it, we have to take the message to the parents, take the message to the Black community. And I think that Black radio, Black television is a great source for doing that. And the numbers show that. But more than that, I think there's an overall philosophy that we have to become aggressive and take control of the messaging about charter schools. As I said originally, I was a member. I was the president of the Washington, D.C. Teachers Union. And while a leader of the union, and I was not, first of all, let me be very transparent, I was not always a supporter of charters.
Mm-hmm.
The first couple of years of being a union leader, I walked the union line, and that was I was anti-charter. Now,
if you convert you, there's hope for anybody, right?
Well, yeah, but again, it's like any other system. You have to have some courage and you to step out and go in a different direction. When they say that when everybody in the band is marching in one direction and there's
Mm-hmm.
one person that decides to go in the other direction, well, most people automatically think the person going in the other direction is the one that's wrong. And so when you're going to take and go into a different direction than your colleagues, a lot of times you're going to have to be willing to take the criticisms and everything else that comes with it in order to support Black children. But I think it is significantly important that we take the narrative in describing what charter schools are about. Because as I said, as a union leader before I became a supporter of charters, we controlled the narrative about charter schools. We said that charter schools are taking money from public schools, something that's negative. We said that charter schools were leading us back to segregation. We said that charter schools were a lot of white people trying to make money off Black kids. Things that resonate within the Black community, because if you mention racism, you get our attention. But I think that the real story about charters, the messaging is not going to get out to the Black community without us putting the messaging out. If there's one thing Donald Trump has taught us, messaging works, even when it's lies. It's unbelievable to me that we got, 70% of Republicans believe that Joe Biden stole this election. But that's because of messaging. Now, we don't want to tell lies, but we want to get the messaging out to the Black community that here is an option that is very viable for you and your children to become educated. And so I think it was so important that we hit the Black radio stations, the Black television stations, to let the Black community know we got something to offer and it's good. So that's the main reason. To offer opportunity, people have to know and they have to get the correct message. And the correct message is that charter schools offer a brilliant opportunity for you and your children to be educated in a more surround environment for the whole child to be educated. And that's not to say that traditional public schools are not good, because there are some good traditional public schools. There are some good charter schools. There's some bad traditional public schools. There are some bad charter schools. But the key here is that our children and parents deserve options. How do you give kids options for cell phones, for tennis shoes, for all of these other things that they can buy, but then say the most important thing in their life, which is education at this point, especially for poor kids, we're not going to give you but one choice. So I think charter opportunities are so important, but we got to take the message where it's needed, and that's to the Black community. So that's why I felt that we needed to really do Black radio and TV.
Very powerfully stated. Ebony, so to make this thing happen, we had to recruit these captains in 14 markets. And specifically, we were looking for charter school leaders also to be spokespersons. Now, you touched on this a little bit in your earlier remarks, but we made a deliberate choice not to go with the usual suspects, not to go with the big name charter leaders, and to kind of avoid the more popular voices and go with lesser known leaders, because we thought that was the right thing to do. But why do you think that was an important thing to do? And what benefits do you think it brought to our campaign?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I touched on it a little bit, but I'd like to expound a little bit now to just say that there are so many Black and brown leaders who are doing the hard work of educating kids every day, and they represent the choices of Black and brown parents. And so while it was just the leader that we saw during this campaign, they are the visual embodiment of hundreds of parents, often low income, who have made practical and intelligent decisions about where they send their kids for school. And to George's point earlier, most of America doesn't know that. And so they were willing to put the chalk down. They were willing to put their books down and put together social media tags in order for people to see them and to hear them. And they felt empowered during this time. And this is, again, no slight on the larger CMOs, but it was the time for those that have been toiling behind the scenes to come out. And they did that mostly not for themselves, but for the people that they represent. And as we've been talking about during this season, these are the voices that are often left out. These are not the voices that are a part of any sort of polling or media campaigns typically. And so in order for these voices of these single moms, of grandparents that are making choices for their children, this is why we wanted to showcase a different side of the charter movement.
Awesome. I am going to take a little bit of a little turn in our programming, and I want to share with the folks who've joined us today the actual creative materials that we made, because they touch on a lot of the things that both George and Ebony and Kaleem have been talking about. So let's start by listening to this radio spot. Let's see if I can get that to start from the beginning. It does not like to start from the beginning. Okay, I'm going to try that again. It does not like to start from the beginning. Oh, wait a minute. Okay.
Peter and a created one.
Okay,
My
hold on. Okay, here we go.
great public school in my community. So I created one. My charter school is one of the top public schools in Atlanta, serving mostly Black and brown students. That's right, a charter school. I know the quality of education our babies deserve. I'm an educator and a mom. I support charter schools. And I vote. I just hope our candidates are listening. Brought to you by the Georgia Charter Schools Association.
I'm a charter school student.
I'm a charter school parent.
A supporter.
A teacher.
A charter school founder.
I vote.
I vote.
I vote.
I vote.
I vote.
I vote.
And we support charter schools.
These are the real faces of charter schools. 70% of students are Black or brown. Our children matter. Our schools matter. Our voices matter. Brought to you by the DC Charter School Alliance and Friendship Public Charter School.
Okay, so I just wanted you guys to be able to see the actual pieces that we created. Kaleem, I want to move over to you next. So did you hear any feedback from people in the community when we started running these spots in your market, and when we started having you as the voice of the charter school movement in Milwaukee? And what was that like?
Got some emails. Yeah, there were a handful of people who were surprised, number one, to see me on that. I had to remind them, I said, I was involved in the charter school movement nationally in the late 90s through the 2000s. Then I drifted away and did other things and came back. But the support that we've generated for our school in this community, in this state, is unique. And I tell people that, I've had the benefit of working to help people develop schools, advocating for schools, but I hadn't done one on my own. So I had this 30 years almost of history to look to and say, how could we do this in a way where we could really be seen as a model for what public education could look like going forward for our children, like a real complete redefinition of it. So everything from our messaging to the design of the school to how we engage the community has been different. Now, people should know when I came back to Madison, my hometown in Wisconsin in 2010 from Washington, D.C., I was a leader of the Urban League here, and we tried to start a single gender school. We're going to have boys and girls. And this community blew up. They tried to kill me, basically. There's a book written about the experience that was, I think, published a few years ago by a professor. But it was amazing. But it really tipped our whole city upside down, because in this liberal community, it showed that underneath all of that, there was a lot of not only racism, there was a lot of classism in this community. This city was designed for people that have means. Anyone who doesn't, you struggle. And so it pulled the Band-Aid off of all of that. But what happened is it allowed other people now to really start addressing this issue, where now it's been like over the last 5 years, a landslide of focus on racial equity issues in our community, but it's given people time to get on board with it too. So our schools were developed along that timeline. And so the teachers union, which literally where I'm standing, their building is within walking distance. It's like 200 yards from me. It's just over the hill. They were vehemently opposed to our school. But when asked just last year in March by their teachers union leader what they thought about charter schools, he said, well, we're still opposed to independent charter schools. In our state, they have charters of districts that they own. Districts own these schools. And they asked about, well, what about one city schools? And he said, well, we actually like Kaleem school. We're trying to figure out what they're going to do. And it's because what we decided to do was we said, we're going to be very transparent. We're going to let everybody in to see what we're doing. We're going to unapologetically say we're independent, but you can come through and tour. So people were coming through and touring from the very beginning. They were speaking into the agenda of the school. And it's really hard for them to peel back and not support it. And so what we've been able to generate in our community is a new sense of a renewed set of support for public charter schools. We're also chartered by the University of Wisconsin system, which is tremendously credible institution in our state. And we're their first real true public charter school. And so we have a lot of relationships with the university. We have a longitudinal evaluation that's going on in our school from preschool. We'll go all the way through adulthood with our kids. And so the way we've done it with learning from others has really helped us build support. So we haven't honestly had any real serious backlash. Now, it's also, there's not a real local movement in Wisconsin right now for charters. And once we start moving that forward soon, we could probably experience some. But I think the fact that we brought people on, we converted folks over by how we did things, that's been helpful.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Kaleem. George, I want to circle back to you, and I want to talk a little bit about the creative materials that we just shared with our friends that joined us today. So, when you're making ads, it's important to be able to break through the clutter and to create content that's compelling and provocative. What do you think was a key goal that we needed to achieve with these TV spots? And what did you hear also as a person in the Washington, D.C. market where we were running a lot of these ads as well? You're muted, George. I will unmute you. How about that? Okay.
All right. Good. I thought that the TV ads were excellent, that they portrayed what I thought was very important, and that is there are a lot of Black folks who support charter schools, because that narrative was not out there. I think that the ads accomplished that. But I think even more importantly, it's the beginning of charter schools taking the narrative and explaining the narrative so that Black folks know charter schools are fine, that this is an option. I think that in looking at what Kaleem said, I think that it is so important that we look at charter schools synonymous with education. It's not just about what kind of school do you attend, because a lot of the debate has been about whether it's a traditional public school or whether it's a charter school. The bottom line is really about education. And in order to meet our goal, if we are really talking about racial equity, we can't get racial equity without also including as a subset of that educational equity. We can't reach educational equity by saying there's only one road that can get poor brown and Black children to the goal, and that is traditional public schools. Are we saying we can't give you more than one option when this is such an important thing? So I think that what we did when we showed all of the Black faces that support charters, it made it okay for other people to take a different perspective of charters than the one that anti-charter leaders or even my friends in the unions have painted, and that is charter schools really aren't for Black people. Well, yes, they are. So I think the ad was very good in doing that, but it also took the narrative. One of my friends said to me, "Y'all are finally standing up, aren't you?" I'm like, yeah. Say, yeah, charter schools have been just been beaten down by anti-charter persons painting negative pictures. That this is the first time I've seen charter stand up. And I said, oh yeah, but there's more coming, because it's not about charter versus public, it's about education. And charter school leaders are about education. When you see those Black leaders, you can trust your education to these folks, right? They understand your kids. So at least it's an option. It doesn't mean that every charter school is a great charter school. But I think we got that message out. And I hope we continue to paint our own narrative, because this has become such a media focused world until you can't get very far unless you get your message out there. Whether social media, TV, or whatever, we got to tell our story, because if we don't tell it, someone else is. And they're not going to tell it the way that we tell it. So I think that it was a great image to see those Black faces on TV supporting charter schools, because it helped for people to see, no, charters aren't what they're saying. Look at the Black folks here who support charters. So I thought that the ads were very effective in that sense. Now, I did have a couple of friends who say, well, why is it focused so much on Black? We're not afraid to focus on Black. 70% of our kids are Black. So why can't we say, we serve Black kids? We do, and they need to be served. Telling the truth and then being aggressive about it and not being afraid to say it is what we got to do with the charter school movement. Right now, charter schools for poor people and people who don't have means, for private schools and etc. This offers an option and an alternative to traditional public schools that is sorely needed. And the only opposition to it, folks, are people with self-interest. When I was a union leader, I had self-interest. My opposition to charters, to be honest with you, had nothing to do with the quality of the schools. It had to do with the fact that charter teachers are not unionized. And you don't have unionized teachers, you're taking my teachers, because as charter schools grow, they need more teachers. Their teachers aren't unionized, you are taking money away from unions. That's the real bottom line in terms of charter opposition, is your teachers aren't unionized, and that affects the union's coffers. But the bottom line here is that charter schools, especially based on the pandemic, offers an excellent opportunity for charter schools to demonstrate what they can do, because they are smaller. They can turn things around so much faster. I think someone gave a comparison that I like, is that turning a traditional public school system around, let's say for DC, we have about 120 schools. You got to turn around 120. You got to think for the whole system. Whereas a charter school, independent charter school, you can turn it around so quickly and adapt. And that's going to be the advantage. And I believe that will have to be the way of the future if we are really going to tailor education to our kids. We can't just keep one big system that says we're going to set the rules and regulations for 120 schools when your one has to follow that rule, whereas your charter schools are nimble and agile and they can adapt to what is the needs of the schools are. So but I think one of the most important things I heard was folks said, y'all are finally standing up. That's the thing that I remember most of all, is that charter schools are finally standing up.
Thank you, George. Ebony, a lot of people are surprised to hear how many charter school leaders of color there are. I know you might not be able to speak for the whole sector, but specifically with Charter School Growth Fund, I'm wondering if you could talk about the percentage of your portfolio that's Black or Brown, and maybe any trends that you've seen over the past several years with that.
Yeah, so I will start with Charter School Growth Fund several years ago, about 7 or 8 years ago, created a fund called the Emerging CMO Fund. And that fund was dedicated exclusively to Black and Brown leaders. And I would say that when that fund was first announced, we had modest goals. It was beyond successful, wildly successful, and has grown over the past 7 or 8 years to a number of organizations that started off as independent single sites. And we watched these Black and Brown leaders expand and replicate in ways that they didn't even think was possible 7 years ago. And so today we have 67 Black and Brown leaders of color of charter systems. Some of them have one school and teach, have 500 kids. Others lead systems of up to 50,000 kids. And we are ongoing efforts around recruitment as we think about who are the leaders of today and the future. When the charter movement first started, there was lots of criticism that charters were mainly being created and run by white males. I can say that, when we look in 2020, we're seeing 50% of new school starts by people of color. And so to a point George made earlier, it's safe and it's, I think, freeing for a lot of educators to step into the charter space, to offer an alternative to the traditional system, and to offer innovation and creativity that children may not be experiencing in their current school environment. And Black and Brown leaders are stepping up.
Awesome. I'm going to take a question that we got from someone who has joined us today, and so I'm just going to read that in its entirety. Is there any evidence that the Biden-Harris or the Dem Party are hearing your message? It looks to me like they continue to be against all school choice, including charters. Now, I'm certain there are a number of us who can weigh in and provide some insights on that. I'm going to actually kick off since the alliance has been, we just had a conversation with the Biden-Harris transition team on Monday. So we've got a little bit of fresh information from there. They heard. We know that they heard. Now, we've also been told that there is a distinction between campaigning and governing. You probably have heard this too. And that there were things that needed to be said, overtures that needed to be made in order to get the White House. And that the proximity of certain special interest groups, i.e. unions, to the president in the run-up to the election will not necessarily indicate what that will look like once he is governing. And I want to remind folks that we actually saw something pretty similar with the Obama election. You might remember that a number of us were like, oh, this looks kind of interesting and he's very exciting, but what is it going to be? These unions are just like giving him big, wet, sloppy kisses. And he actually got into office and had his own mind. And we are hearing signals that, this is not going to be a cakewalk, but we were heard. And we are also not going to just roll over on this. So that's my contribution to responding to that question, and I open it up to others, Ebony, Kaleem, or George, if you wanted to add anything to it.
I wanted to add one thing that I haven't heard a lot of talk about, which I think is important. And I'm glad that the whole racial equity piece came up, because I think that charters can be an example of what economic empowerment is. When you're looking at Black leaders who are starting charter schools, it offers an opportunity for entrepreneurship. And it offers an opportunity for entrepreneurship using government funding, right? They give X amount of dollars per pupil. So I'm saying that when you're talking about economic equity and et cetera, this is one area where we should be inviting Black charter leaders to open schools all the time, because you don't have to have your own money necessarily to start it all, and you're going to have an income. But the equity opportunity that it provides, there are very few situations where Black folks can get money, that they have a flow that can come in based on their kids, that they can start, in this case, a school, which would be an entrepreneurship business. But it offers an opportunity for us to run our schools, and at the same time to educate kids of color the way we know they need to be educated. That's a win-win.
You know, and I was going to say that we have the chair of the Democratic Party in Wisconsin that helped deliver Wisconsin to the Democrats in our school. We also have some very strong leaders in the Republican Party involved too. So it's an interesting place to be here at One City. But you know, I would doubt that, at least in this state, that although people are trying to push against charters, particularly in Milwaukee, it will be hard for Biden to get a lot of support, especially out of the urban areas here, by doing that. You only lose support rather than gain support. So I think that would be a hard journey for them.
I agree with you, Kaleem. I thought one of the things that was really telling also was that the campaign had been a lot more vocal about its lack of support for charter schools. And when we started piping up a little bit, they just stopped talking about education, period.
Right.
Things got quiet. And so if we were able to at least quiet that noise and back them up a little bit, because we were not just going to roll over, that's an important marker, an important first step. Guys, we've got about 8 minutes remaining, and I've got like another round of questions in my pocket, but I also want to encourage others who are listening in. If you've got questions in the chat, I will definitely make sure that we get those in. Now, Kaleem, I've got one for you. How do you think advocacy organizations like ours can better partner with school leaders of color? One of the criticisms that we've heard is it's not cool to just show up when we need y'all to sign a letter, and to otherwise not be present and not be, good partners. So what does authentic partnership look like to you as a school leader on the ground in Milwaukee?
Maybe two examples. One is my work in Washington, D.C., since we have George on here. I remember when George wasn't supporting charter schools. He had become the head of the teachers union there. And although, George, I always felt like you could have brought a real big hammer to us. When I was at Fight for Children, my job was to help lead the development of all the options that kids have there now, the voucher program, all the money for charters and the money for public schools. We call it the 3-sector initiative. I was very much behind the scenes, so people I don't think knew there was Black people really helping to drive this. But we had to work with the community in order to do that. So we worked with the Black Ministers Alliance. We worked with Anthony Williams' office. He was very much in the lead of it. Kevin Chavis, who was the head of he was the council education chair at the time for the city council. He was very much at the forefront of it. But we had to go out in the neighborhoods. I remember having Gene Hickok when he was the deputy secretary of education, and Nina Reese, who's leading the National Alliance of Public Charter Schools, out in the neighborhoods when she was at the Department of Education, walking with us, knocking on doors to talk to residents before any decisions were made about that policy. And so for organizations to get involved in our community, you really got to have a community first strategy. Our intention was, we know there were a lot of people that wanted to see vouchers in the schools in the district, people who wanted to see public charter schools grow, but what did the community want? And so we took the risk of literally putting our resources into hiring people and actually going out to develop those relationships and talk to people, and then come up with a very authentic proposal that people were willing to go with. And it was successful. It had its opposition, but I think that because of the way we did it, it was able to win support over time, versus if we had went in with a hammer and a blowtorch, we would have had people fighting against us forever. You would never get a brother like George who, you could see his heart where it was. You wouldn't have given him an opportunity to give him a chance to get involved, because we would have had a cannon pointed against him and everybody he cares about. And so when you go in and you work with us, it's not just about going to meet with us, giving us some grant money and hoping we come along. You got to understand, what do we risk by getting involved in something that's new? We mentioned, Ebony, about how now you've got all of these 67 leaders. But I remember when we were talking about how come we can't get more money for Black folks, but then we'd look at it and Black people were sitting in the corners like, wait a minute, I don't know if this is safe for me to take a step yet. Change takes time. And so we're at that point now where we could really see more momentum built in our community. So when you hear people talking about now let's go against charters, maybe there is that fear that some who are like the status quo have, that, well, now they can truly see the momentum of African Americans getting behind this and starting to make it their own. I'm glad that would put a lot of fear in people. But for organizations to partner with us, is one, you got to have some people on your team, leaders. They can't just be your community outreach specialists doing this. They got to have real serious jobs, because we understand that that's what should happen. Sorry, my kids are waving at me. We also have to ensure that we're investing in those communities, and that when we invest in those leaders, that we understand that there's more that they have to do in their community in order to win and build support. So we have to be willing to invest in them, helping to develop that support. It's not just about building the school. And then the third thing is we got to stick with them. You can't just make a one-time investment and then say, all right, you go on, because we said how long it takes change to take place. It takes a while for people in communities to turn around. And I want to give a shout out to Ebony and Charter School Growth Fund, because I'm telling you, being here in my hometown, which is ground central for Hayden charter schools, where it was, had we not had an outlet like them to look to support us, or me in particular, and just the network of people I've been able to connect with there, I don't think we'd be I know we wouldn't be as far as we are right now. So I want to thank you guys for that. And last thing, when COVID hit, watching the speed at which these charter school leaders, one, partnered together. Second was the Charter School Growth Fund put its resources on the table and said, hey, here's some money, help your families, do what you need to do. I didn't feel any reticence or any blocking going on to us getting the help that we needed. So seeing how quickly they pivoted and turned to address these issues so they could stay open for our kids, or quickly serve them virtually in our communities, it's powerful. But you got to have organizations that are willing to make the investment to do that.
Awesome. Guys, we've got a great two-part question that came up into the chat, which might be the last thing we're able to do before I have to shut us down. So the question is, do you have any data or intuition on how highly Black parents of charter students rate education as a voting issue? So I do have a little bit of information on that. There was some polling that was done in the run up to the election on the biggest voter issues, and then they did disaggregate them by race. So education is not anybody's highest issue, but it did come in the top 4, which is higher than it used to. And so it came in just behind health, the economy, safety. And then education was the number 4 issue. What we did see in a number of places where we educated voters, and through our C4, we really went deep in certain communities where we educated voters about down ballot decisions, they were education voters. And so while that might not have been what would have motivated them to choose the president, for example, when you gave them information, and we did, about their state legislatures, about the elected school board officials. It was amazing what happened. Charlotte, North Carolina comes immediately to mind. That was a really interesting race. So we had a Democrat and a Republican, and the Democrat was highly favored and was really looking like she was going to win. We did a candidate forum with those two candidates, and the Republican was by far the underdog. She was saying right. She was saying the right things on school choice and on charters, and she won. And I got to tell you, I was actually surprised that it happened. But and I'm not saying that the candidate forum was the only thing, but really educating voters about these down ballot races was incredibly important. And we do see that they became education voters with down ballot candidates. Y'all, I am at time. It is 1 hour. This has been so fun and it went so fast. Thank you, Ebony, Kaleem, and George for working with me on this campaign and also for joining me today. And thank you everyone else who was able to join us.